The air inside the hall folded like heat itself. Sparks fell in brief incandescent showers and hung for an instant as if suspended, then fell again to the dark concrete. Metal sang under hammers and pneumatic guns, a steady percussion that set the bones of the building to vibrating. Men and women moved through the noise with the ease of people who had learned to speak in a language of blows and welds. A glance, a nod, the complex choreography of hoists and plates. Near a row of massive furnaces, an unfinished hull lay on jacks like a patient on an operating table, its belly open to the technicians who had been ordered, by telegram and by urgency, to make it whole in 90 days. If you want to hear how a tank was born in 3 months, stay with us and leave a like. There is a reason the clock mattered. They called him Mikhail Petrov among the men, but for the assembly line, he was simply the man with the square shoulders and the soft, deliberate voice. As chief engineer, he wore his years in the small, steady movements that steadied others. A hand extended to catch a slipping drawing, a finger laid patiently along a weld to test its seam. He had come from a lifetime of steel, drafting rooms with chalk dust under his nails, nights over the glow of blueprints, and in the factory, his presence shaped the way metal would remember itself. Where other voices barked and commanded, Petrov spoke as if coaxing. An equation put into plain speech, a problem pared down to what could be fixed with heat and time. Outside the windows, the Siberian winter bit at the eaves, but inside the plant, it was summer of the technical mind, hot, sharp, and blessed with the smell of oil and burning flux. The slogan banners, threaded between crane rails, folded against the rafters like red prosceniums, urging speed and vigilance. Telegrams arrived in the morning, hands trembling enough to blur the type. A front needed armor, a new model to replace the ones that could not keep up. The brass wanted numbers. The men in uniform wanted a miracle. The engineers had 90 days. They did not pretend it would be easy. The task was, by any practical measure, an invitation to failure. To design a new hull and turret shape that would improve ballistic deflection, to adapt a powerful diesel engine for heavier loads, to rework suspension to bear the extra tons, and to do it while enemy bombs were falling on plant yards and supply lines were threadbare. This was a kind of arithmetic that did not leave room for elegant theory. It demanded practical ingenuity, a judicious mix of borrowed parts, of repurposed dies, of foundry improvisations. The men and women in the plant knew war had a way of measuring talent by how fast you could invent a workaround. Petrov kept a small desk tucked against a far wall of the assembly bay, its surface littered with sketches, margin notes, and a single photograph of a boy no more than 10. He opened the drawers rarely and with a kind of private ceremony, and once, while a young draftsman argued about the curvature of a turret ring, Petrov took the photograph out and set it between 2 calipers, as if to remind himself why precision mattered. He had the engineer's tendency to translate the world into tolerances and fit, but even his calculations bore a quiet moral weight. He would later write, in lines that read like confessions, that he never entirely divorced the mathematics from the faces that would ride inside the metal. When they tested an armor thickness, he imagined the man behind the periscope. The technical heart of the task was stubborn and clear. Armor plates had to be thick enough to survive common calibers, yet molded in ways that allowed weight savings. The turret ring had to be machined with tolerances that would permit a heavy gun to traverse without jamming. The engine, if they were to keep to the schedule, would have to be a rugged diesel which could be adapted from an existing design rather than developed from scratch. That calculus meant, in practice, 1,000 small trades between ideal design and plausible manufacturing. Every single plate, bolt, and bushing was a decision tree. "How will it carry the weight?" asked Ivan Baranov, a mechanic whose voice still carried the rasp of the front. He had come back with a limp and a letter folded always in the breast pocket of his overcoat. He had lost a brother on a convoy run, and he measured his days now in the rhythm of bolts tightened and panels aligned. We fit the V2 block, yes, but the torsion bars, will they take the strain? Petrov looked at the sketches and then at Ivan's hands. They will if we change the bracket mounts and relieve the welds where stress gathers, he said. We will add gussets. It will be heavier but more honest under load. His voice was not soothing, it was practical. There is a certain consolation in being given a piece of the problem you can touch. Welding roared through the days and nights. The plant ran in shifts. Men who had been night watchmen once now bolted turrets under lights that made steam bloom. Women who had served as typists and clerks learned to operate lathes and grinders. Their nimble work on spline shafts and gear teeth kept the supply moving. The supply lines were a patchwork. Gearboxes came from a relocated lathe shop 300 kilometers away. Armor castings were poured from molds repurposed from civilian presses, and the main gun's barrel was adapted from a naval stock that required retreating anneals to make it tractable for rapid rifling. The foundrymen solved 1,000 petty disasters by the light of pry bars and slag, casting voids filled by hand, joints buttressed with creative brazing. Technical explanation, briefly. The belly of the machine was designed around a diesel engine because diesel avoided the flammability and the fuel inefficiencies of lighter gasoline engines, and because diesel torque gave better low-speed pulling power, important for crossing cratered fields and rubble. The suspension used torsion bars, long metal rods that twist under load. They could be arranged to spread forces evenly and allowed for a lower profile, essential both for stability and for making the tank harder to spot. Armor plates were face-hardened in places to shatter incoming projectiles on impact, while softer backing steel absorbed residual energy. Each of these technologies was not an invention that appeared whole, but a negotiation with materials and the manufacturing practices of the day. Failures accumulated like shavings on a lathe. The first set of torsion bars cracked under simulated rough terrain tests. The engineers had underestimated the cumulative shear at certain weld nodes. A cast turret suffered blowhole porosity and had to be reworked, costing days that were currency at a premium. One of the diesel blocks suffered a poorly timed coolant surge during a bench run. The block warped and had to be replaced. Each time something broke, the plant's rhythm tightened. Over time, debates at a drafting board that smelled of coffee and oil. The furtive but necessary cannibalization of less critical machines to keep the prototype moving. It was in these small, miserable failures that the collective expertise flexed and hardened. They learned what the metal would tolerate, where to add redundancy, where to remove unnecessary complexity. There were moments of human quiet, scattered letters, a bowl of porridge shared by two women at the lathe, a drawing passed from hand to hand with a hurried pencil correction. Anna Sokolova, who ran the turret mounting team, kept an old ring in her pocket that she had not the courage to claim was engagement or simply a token from a lost husband. She was fierce in the shop, the sort of forewoman who could look at a misalignment and name the responsible tool by its shadow. Once, late in the second week, she found Ivan asleep with his head on a stack of blueprints. She made tea and, without much ceremony, set a cup by his hand. "You must not drink the works tea every night," she said, and the line of humor was a rope thrown into the grind. Time in the factory lost its ordinary cadences. Days were counted by milestones. The first welded hull seam finished, the turret ring bored true, radio mounts installed. A board near Petrov's desk tracked progress with chalk. Hull, complete. Suspension, fitting. Engine, awaited. Beside that practical ledger, Petrov added another note in a handwriting that was almost private. "Do not rush to victory without thinking of the cost." It read less like scolding and more like a mantra. The endurance test was scheduled 3 weeks ahead of the delivery deadline. It would be the machine's long confession. Hours of continuous operation under simulated combat loads to see what gave way. The test cell was a long expanse of concrete rutted by previous trials. Technicians rigged a dummy turret loaded with ballast, sensors taped with improvised care to strategic joints, a tachometer wired to record revs. The engine that Petrov had insisted on was bolted into its mount with the precision of a surgeon. When they fired it, the plant seemed to count its own breath. At the first turn of the key, the diesel coughed and then found a rhythm, a low, honest growl that rose and settled like a living thing. Through the test's first hour, there were shutters and adjustments, valve clearances checked, a coolant hose that needed a clamp. In the fifth hour, a bearing began to overheat, and the men crowded the test stand, faces flushed in the glare, spanners in hand. Petrov did not shout. He moved with the method of someone who hears the thin song of tolerances. They shut down, replaced the bearing, and restarted. Time was bleeding, but so was learning. By the 12th hour, the machine refused to die. It ran through torque cycles and simulated sprints, through a section meant to mimic muddy bog, and a later loop that simulated a sudden climb. The test log, scribbled in a ledger that smelled of kerosene, recorded times, temperatures, and the minor failures they had fixed. It read like a litany. 1145, torque spike, adjusted governor. 1300, slope test, suspension flex within limits. 1620, fire risk flagged in turret motor, replaced wiring harness. When, 8 hours later, maintenance men finally let the engine spool down, the room was full of a kind of exhausted relief. The machine had passed more than any single metric. It had proven it could be made competent by human effort and adaptation. Triumph was not a trumpet in the plant. It was a shared nod, a handful of cigarettes passed in quiet before the men returned to the continuous and humbling work of replication. The prototype was no longer a concept. It was a set of jigs and patterns, a cast and a memory from which they could multiply more. The 90-day deadline shrank from a doom sentence to a rallying horizon. When, on a cold dawn 3 weeks later, the test convoy rolled out toward the training grounds, the whole factory seemed to exhale. The tank, its paint still fresh and smelling faintly of solvent, moved with a gait that was both hesitant and proud. Its tracks chewed snow and gravel. Its hull shed the mud of the makeshift road. Observers in coats with brass buttons watched as the commander climbed the hatch with a periscope held like a baton. A maiden run could be merely functional, but this one felt like an answer. To telegrams, to anxious faces at the front, to the time spent in the long nights of the foundry. Field acceptance trials were brisk and exacting.
The tank slalomed through obstacle courses, fired its main gun at a target range, and sustained hours of movement under conditions meant to approximate the shock of combat. When the gunnery officer reported the main breach would open smoothly after extended rapid firing, the hall where engineers huddled let out an audible, quiet breath. They celebrated with the modesty of those whose joy is tethered to further tasks. News of their success traveled by dispatch. Convoys were organized. Brothers and husbands and wives who had labored on the line watched as the first production models were loaded and sent toward the depots that would carry them to the front. There was pride, sharp and real, a working-class pride in making a thing that could change outcomes. There was also a silence in corners where a photograph no longer had a face behind it. The men who made armor sometimes paused at openings and imagined the metal as if it could be both life and instrument. The ethical cost threaded through the plant like smoke. Petrov never pretended the machine was anything but a weapon. In quieter moments, behind the engineering office door, after the last weld cooled, he would ask the question aloud to a willing listener. Are we making safety for our side, or are we making better means to kill? He did not find an easy answer. The truth he accepted was an engineered ambiguity. The same coal and steel that defended could be used to destroy, and the measure of success was tempered by the faces that might be born from it. Deployment reports, when they arrived, were blunt and sober. The new tanks bolstered assaults, reduced infantry casualties in certain operations, and altered tactical plans. But they also enabled larger-scale offensives, operations that widened battlefronts, intensified bombardments. Petrov read these dispatches at his desk and folded the paper until it was nearly papery with handling. The machines he helped bring into being performed as intended. Their performance rippled outward into theaters where instrumentality and human cost braided and tangled. After the war, the plant quieted in ways that might have been mistaken for peace. Production slowed, the fevered rhythm of 90-day miracles retired, replaced by demobilization and a return to peacetime manufacturing. Many of the workers kept the habits the war had taught them: a preference for measured speech, a habit of checking welds twice. Some of the tanks were preserved in yards, their paint weathering into a strange, utilitarian patina that looked like patience on metal. Others were scrapped, their steel melted down for bridges, tractors, and 1,000 ordinary uses. The prototypes that had been raced into existence became museum pieces or were cannibalized for spares. Some machines themselves were quietly understood as obsolete the moment jet engines climbed into service and changed the geography of war. In the decades that followed, Petrov's role condensed into a few lines in a technical memoir and an interview that circulated among students of mechanical history. He refused to be lionized. He referred, again and again, to the people who had bolted the tanks together, the women whose hands learned tolerances on the factory floor, and the foundry men who coaxed a cast into life. When asked whether he had felt heroic, he would answer, "We were faithful to the drawing board, that is all." The museum plaques would later simplify a complex human story into a neat sentence about industrial heroism. Petrov's own memory remained complicated and private. The plant itself survived in altered form. Its cranes rusted and were later repurposed. Its test track became a recreational road. The hall where sparks had fallen like rain carried the echo of those early hammers for years, sounds the ears carried as a sense memory. Visitors to the small local museum would stand before the preserved tank and run a gloved hand along its glacis plate, feeling cool metal that once knew heat. Guides would tell the story of the 90 days with a reverence that smudged into pride and, if the guide was honest, into a question. What responsibility comes with the capacity to do this work? The answer, like most human answers, resisted closure. The metal remembered only what it was asked to do: bear stress, deflect shells, carry men. The people who made it remembered both the work and the faces of those who rode inside, memories that complicated the tidy narratives of victory. In the end, the story that left the plant was a mixture of practical genius and improvisation, of cost and courage, of the everyday dignity of people who showed up and solved small impossibilities until a machine could stand and be called a tank. Night had fallen the evening the last hall left the jigs, and the hall emptied slowly. Anna turned off the bench lights with a hand that trembled slightly. Fatigue or a private grief, the two were hard to tell apart. Petrov walked the floor one last time and placed his palm on the cool steel of a hall. It was a ritual more than a blessing. The metal held the print of his fingers for a breath, and then nothing. Outside, a distant engine hummed as a convoy took the bulk of the production away, headlights like slow stars crossing the snow. Years later, children who visited the museum would press their faces to glass and ask about why war was made. Teachers tried to answer with simplified histories, but the best answers were the quiet ones. That technology is a mirror. It can reflect our need to be safe, and it can reflect our capacity to hurt. To make a tank in 90 days is to learn how much can be made when a people choose to apply all their craft to an urgent command. The moral question does not dissolve with efficiency. It accumulates in the creases around the eyes of those who remember.
The plant's heartbeat cooled, and in the quieter hours, you could hear echoes of it. A remembered hammer, the distant hum of engines, the faint clink of a wrench left on a bench. The machine they had made lived on, some in museums, some in scrap, some in the hands of men who would later weld tractors and bridges and listening posts. Petrov's notebooks ended with a single line under a date. "We did what we could under the orders we were given. The rest is for history to weigh." When the convoy that had carried the first models to the front returned months later, empty of armor but carrying stories, the foreman gathered and read the field logs. There were entries that spoke of lives saved in certain engagements, and entries that spoke with quieter voice of cost. The tally of success was not a single number, but a nut of human reckonings. Among the men, the pride of making something that worked lived alongside the old question about ends and means. They lit a cigarette and did not speak, because some conversations require the long, slow work of return. Outside the museum, where one of those tanks sat on a plinth, the winter sun found the edges of its glacis and made the metal momentarily bright. A small plaque explained dates and facts. A larger silence explained the rest. The machine's shadow on the snow was a sober geometry, precise and unyielding, much like the engineering that had brought it into brief life. The story of 90 days remained a story of human persistence, of heat and cold, of failure and repair, of hands learning what metal could bear. It was also a reminder that the capacity to build is always entangled with the capacity to employ what is built. If you felt moved by this account, consider subscribing and share in the comments whether you see technology as a savior or a warning. The conversation matters as much as the machines we remember. Sometimes the museum's quiet was broken by a different kind of footstep. Slow, deliberate, the gait of a man who had once measured distances by the echo inside a hull. He came in the afternoons when the light slanted and the metal took on a color that was almost warm. He carried with him a smell of tobacco and oil, and a folded cap the museum shop had reproduced for nostalgia's sake. He would stand before the tank and not touch it, his hands kept to his sides as if touching might erase the difference time had made between then and now. When he spoke, his voice was small, not trying to fill the hall. Children on school trips sometimes drifted close, drawn by the quiet authority of someone who seemed to remember the thing itself rather than the plaque. He answered their questions with short sentences, the kind that do not pretend to simplify the world. "It was loud," he would say. "You learned the engine's tremor. You knew when to trust the bolts." To the adult who asked if he had been afraid, he would nod without theatricality. "Afraid of what? Of what can happen? You do what you can." Anna watched him one afternoon from the bench where she sometimes did paperwork for the museum, inventory lists, schedules for guided tours, small restorations that required a steady hand and a willing heart. She had been there the day the tank was removed from the plant and given over. She had turned out the bench lights and placed her palm on metal. She had written Petrov's line into the ledger. Years later, she still thought in that ledger's columns. Tasks completed, things to be returned to, the spaces where memory needed to be tended. She thought of the men who came back from the front with stories that were less about triumph than about the texture of survival. They told of nights when visibility was nothing and sound meant the world, of comrades who did not climb down from the turret. They did not always speak of strategy or of glory. They spoke of the small, precise things that had kept them alive, a weld that did not fail, a seam that had been reinforced, a hinge that had held. In those stories, the plant's work and the soldier's luck braided together. One summer, a schoolteacher arrived with a class from the city. He was younger than the veterans, wearing a shirt with sleeves rolled and carrying a tablet for attendance. He asked if he might speak with Anna after the tour. The children clustered around the hull as if it were a planet and they had been given permission to orbit.
Anna led them through the space, through the shadow of the glacis, around the preserved tools, past a photograph of Petrov and his foreman, faces gaunt with fatigue and satisfaction. They touched with gloves, they asked, and when they left, Anna found the teacher in the courtyard, looking at the plaque with a tilt to his head she had come to recognize in others who carried questions home. "I want them to know," he said when she approached, "that machines are made by people, not just engines and steel, habits, choices, small inventions." He spoke without judgment but with intention. There's a lesson about craft in all this. There's also a lesson about responsibility. How do you teach both? Anna thought of the bench lights and of Petrov's palm on the hull. "You show them both," she said. "Show the cleverness and the cost. Let them sit with the contradiction. Our job is to refuse tidy endings." The teacher nodded. He asked whether the museum could host a program where students would bring projects, models of bridges, of agricultural equipment, and the class would talk about the ways those things could be used. Anna agreed. It felt right, a small extension of the plant's legacy, a place where hands and conscience could be taught together. Meanwhile, in a cramped flat near the edge of town, Petrov's notebooks lived on a shelf under a careful dusting. His daughter had wrapped them in linen the first winter after he died, and then placed them where the light did not fade the ink.
People sometimes requested copies. Historians, curious engineers, a graduate student writing a thesis on improvisation under pressure. The daughter would let them read, but the notebooks seemed to demand something different from those who opened them. Not merely analysis, but attention to the nervous rhythm of decision. The pages were dense with diagrams and marginalia, a sketch of a rivet pattern beside a notation about weld temperature, a note about the mood in the shop the day they changed the design. There were lines that read like the end of a prayer, precise, resigned. "We did what we could under the orders we were given," he had written, and elsewhere on the same page, a small flourish, "Beware craft without question." Someone once accused Petrov in a lecture of being sentimental about labor. The accusation did not stick to the notebooks, which were stubbornly practical. But the notion buried itself in discussions. Were the engineers sentimental if they thought about those who rode inside? Were the soldiers sentimental if they thought of the men who had built their shelter? Sentiment here might have been the wrong word. What persisted was a kind of fidelity to the object, to the people who made it, to a sense that work carried an ethical weight. Not long after Anna and the teacher arranged the student program, a journalist arrived from a national magazine. He wanted to write about the plant's 90 days as if it were a singular marvel of modern organization. He wanted photography with bright contrasts, with heroic angles. Anna agreed to show him the museum, but she refused to allow staged photos of men looking almost triumphant beside the tank. She wanted the article to carry the muddle, heat and cold, pride and regret. The journalist found the tension interesting. He lingered on the photographs of welders with soot in their eyebrows, and on an interview with a man who had said plainly, "We were asked to make a thing that would keep men from dying. We did not ask who would point it." The piece ran with a title that sought to be both admiring and sober. Letters came afterward, some congratulatory, some angry, some thoughtful. One woman wrote to tell Anna that her grandfather had been a machinist at the plant and had never spoken of it. The letter's lines trembled with reconciliation. Another reader sent a short note asking whether the tank's presence in the museum romanticized war. Anna wrote back to each letter, not with answers, but with invitations to come and see, to stand in the shadow and listen. At night, when the museum shut its doors and the tank's silhouette lay flat in the snow, Anna would sometimes sit in the dim office and read Petrov's notebooks under a lamp. She traced his diagrams with a fingertip as if following the path that had been walked. The diagrams were not just technical. In margins where he had the space, Petrov had written observations about men, their habits, small acts of kindness, frayed tempers on cold mornings. He had an eye for the ordinary human details that become extraordinary when set against a machine's scale. A cup left on a lathe, a pair of gloves handed from one hand to another across a bench. The precise way a young man learned to steady his breath before a difficult weld. Those details kept returning to Anna. They reminded her why museums mattered, not only to preserve objects, but to preserve the textures of choices. A tank, she had come to understand, was a container for stories, and through those stories, people could face the fact that ability and intention do not always align. The plant had had the ability to build in 90 days. Whether that ability was used wisely required something else, a moral temperature, hard to measure, easy to let drop. The conversation that began to form in the community around the museum took new shapes. The teacher-student program grew into a series of workshops where young people designed tools for civilians, water pumps, small bridges, heating stoves. Each project concluded with a session in which the students considered potential misuse. What might happen if that pump were weaponized? If that bridge became a choke point? It was a sober class, often interrupted by laughter and clumsy models that did not behave the way their creators intended. The laughters were important. They were the exact kind of human noise that had been missing from sterile debates about means and ends. Out beyond the museum, the town continued to shift. The plant had closed years before, its jigs gone to other workshops, its great cranes silent. But the rhythms of craft persisted. Trimmed down, transformed into peacetime work. Tractors mended, school roofs repaired, metal frames for greenhouses manufactured for the new small farms. Men who had once paced the plant floor now pored over plans for irrigation lines. The knowledge traveled like a muscle memory that had been repurposed. The same ways of thinking about stress and load applied to different problems. Yet every so often, the old questions rose up. On the anniversary of the plant's achievement, someone would bring flowers to the small memorial in the courtyard. People of different ages and politics gathered, some to celebrate ingenuity, others to honor the lives that had intersected with violence, others simply to remember neighbors who had learned to read and write in the plant's on-site classes. They lit candles, they told stories. The speeches were uneven. Sometimes they stumbled into rhetoric, sometimes into confessions. The habit, however, remained. The community chose to keep talking. Petrov's daughter donated his final notebook to the museum on one such anniversary. Anna accepted it with a steadiness she did not always feel. The booklet slipped into the museum's archive with its familiar weight. There was an inscription on the inside cover in Petrov's hand, small and unadorned. For those who make and those who live with what is made, remember both. The museum set up a small exhibit around the notebooks, not to canonize the man, but to let his process exist where people could see it. Visitors lingered. Scholars came and left with new questions. A veteran who had once ridden in the tank stood before the display and ran a fingertip over the glass as if trying to read through it. He did not speak. The gesture was enough. The notebooks, it turned out, were a mirror as well, reflecting back not only the nature of the work, but the imperfection of the answers. On a weekday in late autumn, a new letter arrived in the museum's mail slot addressed to Anna. The envelope doubled with the quiet weight of old paper. Inside was a photograph folded in the way people fold things to preserve them. The photo showed a row of young welders, faces serious, their arms crossed or hands in pockets, a tank only partly formed behind them. On the back, in a hand Anna did not need to check to recognize, was written, "We learned to make things that kept men breathing. Do not misremember why we did it." Anna read the line twice and felt the tug of all the conversations the museum held. She thought, as she often did, of Petrov's last line, that the rest was for history to weigh. The weighing would happen in classrooms and courtrooms, in magazines and quiet kitchens. It would happen in the hands of the children who pressed their faces to glass and asked why war was made. She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf with the others. Outside, snow began again in lazy flakes. In the hall, the tank took the light and threw back the shadow. It was only metal and memory, but in that combination, there was a work that demanded conversation. The town would keep that conversation going, imperfectly and insistently, because the alternative, silence, felt like consent to forget. A visitor lingered at the doorway, boots making a soft scrape. "Do you ever think," he asked Anna, "that it could have been different?" Anna looked toward the hull, toward the faint print of Petrov's hand in the metal of memory. She felt the ledger of the past open in her chest. Entries of skill and sorrow balanced against orders and necessity. She answered without flourish. "I think," she said, "that we always have a moment where we must choose how to use what we can make. Sometimes the moment is loud and urgent. Sometimes it's quiet. The work doesn't stop at the thing we make. It continues in how we remember it." He listened. Then he stepped into the hall, toward the tank, and the two of them stood together in the metal's long shadow, not speaking, holding the weight of the souvenir and the question between them.
The museum's lights hummed softly overhead, and snow settled on the steps like a thin promise that history, however heavy, could still be remarked upon. The visitor lifted his hands from the tank's cold flank as if he could feel the story buried there. He was older than Anna had first thought, hair gone thin at the crown, but his posture carried the steadiness of someone who had worked standing up for long hours. When he spoke again, it was quieter. "My name is Mikhail," he said. "We called each other Misha then." He smiled, small and private. "I helped with the welding on that hull. Not the final welds, I was young and slow in those days. But I remember the hum of the cutters, the way the sparks made little suns on the floor." Anna watched him place his palm flat against the metal, not touching so much as giving the surface a companion presence. "You sent the photograph," she said. He nodded. "I did. I have a box at home with a dozen of them. They are all the same faces at different angles. I kept one to remind myself. I don't know why I put that sentence on the back. Perhaps because somebody had to say it plainly." "It's not plain," Anna said. "It is necessary." They moved along the hull, shadows bending under the fluorescence. People came through the hall now and then. 2 school children behind a teacher, a man with a notebook who looked as if he might write about the display. Conversation in the museum had softened in the afternoon since the exhibit opened. Not solemn, but close-voiced, as if the space preferred private confessions. "Do you ever think," Mikhail asked, "that we did it to protect? Or that we did it because orders kept coming? I cannot untangle it. I remember being proud of the seam. It held. And I remember the faces in the pictures that came later." He shook his head. "It sits like 2 weights on my chest." Anna thought of Petrov's inscription in the notebook, of the way the donation had been both a surrender and an offering. "That is why the museum kept the notebooks as they are," she said. "Not to vindicate, not to condemn, but to show the making itself, to let people see what was inside the hands." Mikhail's mouth tightened. "People come and look at the metal and say it is only metal now. That is true, but there is a memory in the welds. You can feel when something was done with care. You can feel when it was done in a hurry." "You said some of the welders had classes at the plant," Anna said. The town had photographed the night classes, the small groups of workers leaning over textbooks. Those images were part of the museum's broader framing. Industry as community, knowledge shared. "Yes," he smiled at the memory. "We learned to read and write. Some of us wrote letters home for the ones who could not. I taught someone to sign his name. He cried when he finally saw his name on a pay stub. We were more than parts. We were neighbors." They fell into a silence the length of a breath.
Outside, the snow pressed down on the window panes in softened sheets. Inside, the hall retained a steady warmth like a held hand. "Have you read the rest of the notebooks?" Mikhail asked at last. Anna thought of the notebooks lined on the shelf, Petrov's small ledger among others, of the way the pages had been catalogued, stamped, and then left accessible to researchers. She had read excerpts, lists of materials, sketches of rivet spacing, a paragraph about the evening light in the workshop, a notation of names in the margin. But she had not read them with someone else at her side, had not watched the words give life to a person standing there in the present. "No," she admitted, "not all of them. The archive is open by appointment. Scholars have come, families too. I keep them available because I think the conversation should be raw sometimes, uncurated." Mikhail's jaw softened. "If you are willing," he said, "there is something I would like to show you. Something that might help the visitors understand we were not monsters, nor saints. We were people with two hands and a head full of songs." Anna looked at him. The museum had a reading room. The curator sometimes set a notebook on a stand, encased in glass, and lit so the pages shone like relics. To take a notebook down and read it with an ex-welder would be to make the private public in a way that might shift perceptions. It would be risky too, risk of misinterpretation, of being taken as an apology. She led him up the short flight to the reading room. It was smaller, lined with shelves of oral histories, local newspapers, and the slim volumes the museum published. The table by the window was empty, a patient square of oak. Snow narrowed to a pale blur on the street outside. Mikhail fished in his coat and produced another photograph. It showed 3 young men on the plant floor, their faces flushed with the heat of the day. One of them, the central figure, had the same way of tilting his head that Mikhail did now. On the back, there was another line, inked in a haste that made the letters slant. "We left because the work taught us everything else. Keep that." Anna set the photograph between them. "Do you think people here will accept that?" she asked. The question was about more than the image. It was about the town's appetite for complexity. He shrugged. "They will accept what they can hold. Some will want to blame. Some will want to forgive. Some will simply not come. But a few will listen." They read aloud, together, a page from Petrov's notebook that Anna took from the shelf. An entry about adjusting a seam. An observation about heat and metal that wandered into a reflection about the men who stood at the forge. The technical lines gave way to an almost pastoral sentence about how the shaft light in the rafters marked the hours like a sundial. When they finished, the air felt like something newly stirred. "He was careful with his words," Mikhail said. "He wrote like someone who knew the weight of a sentence." Anna closed the book gently. "That is how the exhibit is meant to work," she said. "Not to dictate, to provide the parts and let the town assemble the meaning." "We need a place to say more than just what was," Mikhail said. "We need a place to say what we do now." The notion lodged in Anna like a coin, a weight and a potential currency. She had been thinking of the museum as part ledger, part mirror. Petrov's notebooks refracted light. Perhaps the museum could become a place to alter the angle of that light. She proposed an idea then, something she had not yet voiced to the board, a series of community sessions, not panels of experts, but open gatherings where families, workers, veterans, and children could bring objects, letters, and questions. A space where the question, "Could it have been different?" would be asked in many voices and answered in many ways. Mikhail's eyes brightened. A forum, he said, not a debate, a place to speak and to listen.
Yes, Anna agreed. We frame it with the notebooks and the photographs, and then we leave room for people to bring what they carry. Letters, songs, recipes. It will be messy. Messy is honest, Mikhail said. She imagined flyers posted on the library board, notices read in the church and at the market, a low table in the museum's foyer covered in envelopes and small artifacts, a spool of wire, a child's school page with a crude tank drawn in crayon, a soldier's dog tag. The town would arrive with grief and pride braided into the same hands. The museum's role would be to hold the space, not to fix the story into a neat moral. When Anna told the board the plan, responses divided along the same seam the town often showed. Some trustees feared the forums would turn into recrimination. Others, remembering the quiet obstructions of silence, welcomed the chance for a new kind of public reckoning. Petrov's daughter, Anna would learn, had flown in for the meeting and sat with her hands folded like someone rehearsing composure. It will open wounds, one trustee warned. It will also make possible healing that has been postponed, Anna said. We cannot pretend the notebooks change what happened, but they can be a way for the people who lived it to name it. The board voted to try. They set the first session for the day after New Year, a practical choice that gave the town a pause and a chance to breathe. Anna felt both the thrill and the fear of initiating something whose outcome she could not control. Word reached the local paper. An op-ed came from a man who wrote with the clipped certainty of someone who preferred clear lines. Keep the tank, keep the memory, but let us not become a museum of failure. Another column, penned by a schoolteacher, argued the opposite. Children must know the whole story. The tank is a lesson. Do not sterilize it. On the morning of the first forum, the museum filled with the hush of anticipation.
Chairs stood in concentric rings. The tank loomed in the background, half a presence, half a prop. A kettle in the museum kitchen had been set to boil. Someone had brought boxes of tea. Parents hustled toddlers into sweaters. Older men arrived with blunt, careful steps. Mikhail came early and found Anna by the front desk, smoothing a stack of handouts. He handed her a folded piece of paper. "A memory," he said, "for the table." She unfolded it and read a short paragraph written in a straightforward hand. "We made things to keep men breathing. Some of those men did not come back. We learned to read after we learned to weld. I raised my sons by teaching them the meaning of a seam. Listen to them." The first hour moved like a tide. People spoke in halting sentences, then with a flood as the room warmed. A veteran named Sergei described the uniformity of barracks and the way cooks would slice bread just so. A woman whose brother had died overseas brought a photograph of him laughing in a field. A teenager, cheeks still raw from daylight, confessed to writing graffiti of tanks in the night and then painted over them in the morning. The stories braided, some of regret, some of justification, some simply of small, tender domestic acts performed under the shadow of greater forces. A man at the back rose when the room quieted. He was thin and wore a denim jacket with a greasy patch at the elbow. "My father was one of the welders," he said. "He would come home with the smell of oil and say nothing. Once, when I was 10, I found a letter under his pillow to a woman he never named. He said nothing. He held his hands like he was holding the world together. He wiped his face and stepped back. The act of speaking altered people. Where speeches might have hardened positions, the soft cadence of memory invited response over rebuttal. People nodded. A woman with sorrow-still eyes stood and sang a lullaby she had learned as a child. The melody threaded the room and made speech unnecessary for a moment. Halfway through the afternoon, a different sound rose. A man at the fringe shouting that the tank should be removed altogether, that displaying it normalizes the machinery of war. His voice was raw enough to carry, sharp enough to startle. For an instant, the forum teetered, as if the day's conversation could be punctured by a single tension and collapse into two opposing camps. Anna stood. She did not speak as an authority, but as a steward of a space. "We are here to remember," she said, carefully, "to remember how the making of things affected people's lives. If we decide to remove the tank, we should be honest about the reasons. If we keep it, we must do so knowing it will not be the simple symbol anyone wants it to be. It will be a place of contradiction." The man at the fringe grew quiet in the face of that candidness. He had come to make a point. Instead, he was met with an invitation to complicate his own certainty.
By the end of the day, no one had agreed on a single verdict. The tank remained, its shadow longer and more intricate than before. People left with business and with the residue of speaking, a softness in their shoulders, an attentive look as if the air itself had been rearranged. Anna walked Mikkel to the door. Snow had turned to a fine, crystalline rain that fretted at the edges of coats and hat brims. "Will it change things?" he asked. "Not overnight," she answered. "Conversations like this are slow. They are not laws, they are stitches." He stepped away as if to leave, then returned to press the photograph he had brought into her palm. "Keep that," he said. "Put it with the notebooks. Let someone else find it later. If we cannot untangle everything now, at least leave the threads." She did as he asked. Later, when the building was emptied and the lights dimmed to the hum that meant close of day, Anna walked alone to the tank and ran her fingers over the glass of the exhibit that contained the notebooks. The reflection of the hull was a pale silhouette. In the room's hush, she could have convinced herself the metal had softened, had grown human with the stories threaded through it. She did not think that was wholly true. Objects were stubborn. But she believed the museum had altered its use, not a pedestal for judgment, nor a pedestal for forgetting, but a place where the town could practice the uneasy art of holding contradiction together. Outside, the snow had stopped. A thin moon cut through the clouds like a small promise. Anna turned the sign on the front door to closed, and in the quiet she felt the ledger of the past still open in her chest. Entries of skill and sorrow balanced against orders and necessity, and knew the balance would not settle quickly. The work of making and unmaking would continue in small acts, on a table where people left photographs, in the careful reading of a notebook, in the steady practice of listening. She locked the museum and walked down the steps. The town slept with its own memories. Tomorrow, someone would leave a note in the suggestion box. A child would press their nose to the glass. A scholar would request a copy of a page. The conversations would persist because people had chosen to let them. As she crossed the street, she looked back once at the dark rectangle of the building and thought of a sentence from one of Petrov's pages that she had read aloud that afternoon. "What we make extends beyond the hand that made it." It was not an answer. It was, rather, an insistence. It would do. She turned toward her flat and the small light in her window, and the town behind her breathed on into that insistence, imperfect and unbroken.